So it seems that sugar has become the new enemy in our diet. Like, think about it. In countries, sugar in food is being taxed. In high school, they are forbidding sugary drinks. It almost seems like sugar is becoming the new type of smoking. But at the same time, we see sugar in all of our foods, like, of course, in sugary drinks, in food that has extra sugar added to it, but also in healthy food like fruit that contains a lot of sugar, and also healthy alternatives like brown rice and whole grain pasta that also contains a lot of sugar. So what does it mean? Does it mean that we can't eat any of these things anymore? How did sugar actually become this enemy in our food? And is it really bad for us? Okay, so to address these questions, I want to start with the biology. What happens when we eat sugar? So imagine that we're having a fruit juice, a fresh orange juice, that has a lot of sugar. So when we drink it, it gets into our digestive system and then from there directly in our blood. Now, our body has a great way of dealing with this sugar, and this is through the pancreas, which is a small organ just below our stomach. So once the pancreas notices that there's sugar in our blood, it will start releasing insulin also in our blood. And the way that insulin works is that it will start acting like a bouncer. It will be in our blood and basically knocking on all the cells' door, telling them there's a lot of sugar here, you need to take it up. And so this is exactly what the cells do. They take up the sugar, and the sugar eventually drops in our blood. So once the sugar is low in our blood, also insulin goes down. So it's a great system, right? We have sugar increasing our blood and our body deals with it by releasing insulin. The insulin makes it the sugar goes down, and then eventually also insulin will go back down again. Really great. However, in reality, it's not that simple because we don't just have one sugary snack or drink throughout our day, but we have multiple. So sugar often stays quite high in our blood, and then insulin also stays high. And again, if you make the comparison with insulin being a bouncer, just like in a busy nightclub, if you have a long queue outside, all that sugar in our blood, they're not going to go in all at the same time. They will be one by one, and there will be some pauses in between. So the bouncer will keep on knocking, seeing if there's room, but the cells will ignore some of these bounces and will only let sugar in every now and then. So this is basically the beginning of insulin resistance. The cells are resisting some of the insulin signals. Now, here's where it gets really messy, because if you have high sugar in your blood, your pancreas sees that and it wants to get rid of that sugar. And it sees that the insulin is not working, so it starts releasing more and more insulin. So now you have more and more insulin knocking on the cell's door, and they will respond to that initially. They will let more sugar in. But also over time, they will get resistant to that. They will get resistant to those multiple knockings. So you can see that this is a tricky situation, because higher insulin levels on their turn lead to higher insulin resistance, and then again higher insulin levels, and so on and so on. It's a downhill slide from here. And this is reflective of a fundamental principle in cell biology. That is that if you have a signal that is very high or just continuously present, then our body will start ignoring it. The reason for this is that if you have a signal that's always there, it doesn't contain any information anymore. It's not on or off anymore, and it might do our cells harm. Now, to really drive home this message, I want to give another example, a biological example. Imagine that you just started a new job or a new academic year, and you're super enthusiastic and you're ready to respond to those incoming emails. The moment that there's an email, that you have that pop-up sound or you see it popping up on your screen, you will reply to it. But imagine that same situation, but then a couple of months in. Now you are already super busy, you have a ton of work, and you also get in a ton of emails. And every time you have that sound or that pop-up animation, you might look at it, but unless it's really urgent, you probably won't reply to it immediately. And that's the same with insulin and insulin resistance. Insulin is the pop-up, and then you are becoming resistant to the signal. And over time, the busier you get, the more you will start ignoring these. And probably the stronger the signal will become, because if it's really urgent, and more messages will come in. And eventually, even your boss might show up at your desk. So then you'll definitely respond. But you can see that also on our whole body scale, we develop resistance over time to a continuous signal. And so the same happens with sugar and insulin. The more sugar we have, the more insulin we will have, and also the more resistant our cells will become. Okay, but that actually doesn't explain why either of these are bad for us. Is high sugar or high insulin or the resistance of our cells to insulin bad for us? And it turns out that what is really a problem here is that resistance of our cells to insulin. And that is because insulin is such an important player in how our body functions. We mostly know it as its role in regulating blood sugar, but for example, it also plays a role in how our blood vessels are doing. And so if you have insulin resistance, then you might get high blood pressure and heart disease. There was this recent study that suggests that one of the early signs of insulin resistance in men is actually erectile dysfunction. And that's again because insulin works in our blood vessels. Also in women, insulin resistance can have an impact on fertility, where insulin-resistant ovary cells now will start producing more male hormones than they're supposed to. And this can lead to the formation of something that is called PCOS. And it's not only our blood vessels. Insulin also, for example, plays a role in how our brain functions and in proper brain health. So with insulin resistance, this also leads to chronic brain diseases like Alzheimer and dementia. And so it turns out that insulin resistance is at the basis of many of these chronic diseases. So you can see why it's such a problem. But what's really worrying is that I saw some studies that show that up to half of adult Americans show some form of insulin resistance, with one paper even showing up to almost 90% of people showing insulin resistance. That number is so high. But then again, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because think of how we consume sugar on our daily basis. So just starting with breakfast, that's often very high in sugar or in carbohydrates in general. So we would either have some bread with some sugary topping or cereal, fruit juice, also super high in sugar, even something what seems healthy like refined oats, that's also very high in sugar. So then we have our first sugar pulse. Then after breakfast and probably before lunch, we have some sort of snack that is high in sugar or something sweet like coffee with some sugar. Then we have our lunch, which is again very high in carbohydrates. Think of bread, pasta, rice. After that, we have in between lunch and dinner, we probably have another coffee with some sugar or a snack. Then we have dinner, again very high in carbohydrates, again rice, potatoes, bread. And then after dinner, we probably have some sort of dessert. So all throughout our day, we have these constant peaks of sugar in our blood and also very high levels of insulin. So insulin just doesn't get a break, and our cells, it seems logic that they become insulin resistant. Okay, that's a whole list of very bad news, but the good thing is we're definitely not doomed. See, insulin resistance is preventable, and also depending on how severe the insulin resistance is, it is also often reversible. Okay, so how do we deal with this? I want to go over 3 steps, and you'll actually be surprised of how simple and logical they are. So the first one is, of course, sugar in our food. Let's take that example again of the fruit juice, let's say a fresh orange juice versus a whole orange. Now that already makes a big difference, because that fresh orange juice, that grinded orange, all the cells have been broken open, all the sugar is now released into the water, and it's immediately available. And when you drink it, it leads to a massive sugar spike. If you now have a whole orange, when you eat it, it's still intact, and the sugar will be released much slower because of all the fibers, and the sugar is still contained in the cells. So that's already a lot better. And this is what you have to keep in mind with food. You don't want processed foods like a fresh orange juice, but also all those products that contain supplement sugar. You don't want that. You want more natural or real food like fresh fruit, vegetables, of course, but also brown rice, whole wheat pasta, things like that. Another thing is that and this is a really interesting report I read just the other day, is that they did a study where they had two groups of people where they gave them meals that had the same total calories. But one group of people had a meal that was very rich in carbohydrates, sugars, and the other one was very high in fat. Now, again, the same amount of calories, but the group that had the meal with high in fat, they reported that they were much fuller than the group that had the meal high in carbohydrates. So this is also something to keep in mind, that instead of having our meals that are 70% carbohydrates, switch it around, make it more in protein, make it more in fat, in healthy fats, and you will have the same amount of food, but you won't have that craving anymore. And that's also really important. Everyone likes eating, and we don't want to be on a diet our whole life. Okay, so then the second one, this one you've also heard many times before, that is exercise. The reason why exercise is so good for insulin resistance is because our muscles, they crave sugar. They are one of the most metabolically active tissues in our body. And also, unless you're heavily overweight, for most of us, muscle is also the biggest organ in our body. We mostly are composed of muscle. Now, what this means practically is, of course, to do exercises that increase your muscle mass. This will definitely help with overall insulin resistance. But at the same time, exercises like these are not for everyone. But there's also something else that you can do. That is, after you had a meal, if you do some sort of activity for 10 to 15 minutes, and this can be like going for a walk or also just doing house chores, what will happen is that your muscles will be active and they think, okay, we might have to be active for a longer period of time, and they will start soaking up that sugar from the blood. The reason why this is so good is because then your insulin has to work less hard and you get a dampened insulin response, and consequently you also get a lower chance of insulin resistance for the rest of your cells. So also these small type of activities after every meal could be really great. Now, then the last one, and I really like exercise, but this one I definitely like the most, and that is sleep. That it's really important to get a proper amount of sleep. The reason why sleep deprivation is so bad is that when you don't have enough sleep, your body will start increasing the amount of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Now, if you're like me, then when you had a bad night of sleep, you will also drink some extra coffee to be able to handle the day. This on its turn, the caffeine, on its turn will increase the amount of adrenaline or epinephrine in our blood, which is another stress hormone. The reason that these two are so bad is because when our body is in a state of stress, it's getting ready for a fight or flight response. It's getting ready for whatever is needed. So the amount of sugar in our blood will increase. That's what these stress hormones do. Now you can see that this is a problem because insulin wants to decrease the amount of sugar. And so you have these two groups fighting with each other. You have the stress hormones pushing sugar up and you have insulin pushing sugar down. But it also means that insulin will be constantly high and that will contribute to insulin resistance. So here it is super important to have proper amount of sleep to get those stress hormones to normal levels. And then a bonus tip also related to stress is to try to reduce the amount of stress in your life. I know this one is a difficult one. We have busy jobs. Our environment is just at this moment just made to give us a lot of stress hormones in our life. But this is also something really important. I saw a quote the other day, and normally when you see quotes, you read them and you're like, yeah, that's true. And then you forget about them. But this one, I want to pay some extra attention to it because it's so relevant here. So what it says is that when you worry, remember this quote: worrying doesn't take away tomorrow's trouble, it takes away today's peace. And that is so true. Worrying, all the stressing, it doesn't make the problems go away. It just takes away today's peace and increases stress of today. So that's the final bonus tip, to be just more relaxed and happy in life. So in the end, is sugar or insulin? Sometimes people say that insulin itself is so bad. Are they that evil? No, not at all. It's the way that we consume it. It's the way that the food industry has put all that sugar in our food that makes that now we have sugar in constant overload, and that gives us insulin resistance. That's the real big problem. Now, I wanted to share this with you because I'm a cell biologist by training, and I saw insulin and insulin resistance in my education. I also saw it in presentations of colleagues that are working on it. But I never really made a connection with our daily life and how much all that sugar influences how our cells are behaving. So for me, this was a real eye-opener, and I just feel like I have to share it with as many people as possible. But here's what gives me hope. Your body is incredibly resilient and flexible, and with proper food and exercise and sleep, we can reverse years or decades of metabolic damage that we've been doing to ourselves. So I wonder, what are your guys' thoughts on this? Are you aware of how much all this sugar contributes to insulin resistance, and that so many people already show some level of insulin resistance? Let me know your guys' thoughts on this. And also, if you have specific questions on topics, on health, on diet that you want me to address, let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can figure it out.